Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Earth, Water, Fire seminar series. Today's discussion is about public lands. The seminar series has been organized by the 2020 Weiss Scholars from Lewis and Clark Law School, Northern Arizona University, Yale School of the Environment, and Yale Law School with support from the Weiss Foundation. The series has 4 seminars, each focused on a different topic: water, fire, land, and collaborative conservation. These issues are uniquely important in the Western United States, and shifts in policy can have sweeping consequences for the well-being of people and nature in this region. These seminars will highlight important concepts that will support good policymaking in light of the 2020 election. You can learn more about the other discussions in this series at our website, which we will link to in the chat box. We are thankful to the Weiss Foundation for making this seminar series possible and to our experts that will be speaking today. We are also thankful for our university faculty advisors and Caitlin Powers from the Weiss Foundation for their support. Today's panel is Defending Our Federal Lands. This panel will discuss federal land management and the conflicts that exist between conservation and economic priorities. Our public lands are increasingly threatened by privatization and extractive industries. This jeopardizes many critical areas, including the Bears Ears National Monument and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Of course, today is Joe Biden's inauguration day, so throughout the panel, we will incorporate what that means for the future of our public lands. As we discuss public lands today, we also want to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of all of our public lands. We recognize that the concept of federal land management is the result of colonization and forcible removal. Indigenous people remain caretakers of these special places, and we bring this history and knowledge into our work as conservationists in this discussion today. So we'd like to get started with the panel. My name is Maddie Munson, and I'm a third-year law student at Lewis and Clark Law School, focusing on public land and natural resources law. And I will be moderating today's panel along with Katie Pofall.
Hello, I'm Katie Pofall. I'm a second-year Master of Environmental Management candidate at the Yale School of the Environment, focusing on land conservation, organizational leadership, and community engagement. Now, we'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. So briefly, for 1 or 2 minutes, we'll get the chance to hear more about their experiences in depth later in the panel, but for now we'll hear from all 4 of our speakers in turn. First, we'll start off with Martin Nye. He's a professor of natural resources policy and director of the Bolle Center for People and Forests at the University of Montana. Welcome, Martin.
Hello. Well, thanks for having me, everybody. Martin Nye, I'm a professor of Natural Resources Policy in the W.A. Franke College of Forestry and Conservation at the University of Montana, direct the Bolle Center for People and Forests. I've been here in Missoula for about 20 years with a focus on federal public lands and wildlife. I've written quite a bit about federalism issues and most recently a lot about tribal co-management and the possibilities of it on federal public lands.
Thank you, Martin. Next, we'll hear from Keala Carter. Keala is lead advocate and public land specialist for the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition.
Hi, and delighted to be on the panel. So I serve the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, and as Katie mentioned, my title is lead advocate and public land specialist. The 5 tribes that originally coalesced and advocated for Bears Ears to be a national monument are the Hopi, Zuni, Navajo, and Ute Indian and Ute Mountain tribes. So they are also plaintiffs to now the lawsuit challenging Trump's proclamation. And we are eagerly awaiting news from the incoming administration. So I'm happy to be here and happy to talk more about public lands and the ways that the tribes, such as the ones that I serve, can get more involved in the future of public lands.
Thank you, Keala. Our next speaker is Chris Krupp, the Public Lands Guardian at Wild Earth Guardians.
Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Glad to be here. As Katie said, I'm the Public Lands Guardian for Wild Earth Guardians, which is a Santa Fe-based nonprofit conservation organization. And Wild Earth Guardians protects and restores the wildlife, wild places, wild rivers, and health of the American West. My work is focused on keeping public lands in public hands and I'm joining today from Seattle. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And finally, we'll hear from Kristen Miller, Conservation Director at Alaska Wilderness League.
Sorry, I was reacting to the delay. Hi, my name is Kristen Miller. I am the Conservation Director for Alaska Wilderness League. We are a national organization dedicated to protecting federal lands and waters all across Alaska. We are based in Washington, D.C., so I am sitting at my house in Arlington, Virginia, on the traditional homelands of the Piscataway and Anacostan and Indigenous peoples. And as an organization, we work together with Indigenous groups and all kinds of organizations to really work to protect the federal lands and waters all across Alaska.
Thank you, Kristen. This is a great lineup, and our panelists will have a chance to speak on the issues that are important to them. We encourage participants to add your questions to the question and answer function, which is on the bottom panel of the Zoom page. And we may then incorporate these questions into our discussion with the panelists today. So we'll just kick it off here with all of our panelists. We would like to start with a question for Martin and Chris. And recently, in the West, there's been an increase in efforts to either transfer federal lands to state ownership or transfer complete control over these lands to states. How have you seen this play out in your work?
I guess I can begin. To provide a little background, when Western states became part of when they were granted statehood, they were given a couple of parcels in each township across the state that would be used for, which would be held in trust for the benefit of the state. And but the vast majority of lands in those states, federal lands in those states, were reserved for the nation, for the people across the country. But over the past almost 40 years now, there's been a movement from state and local officials across much of the, especially the interior West, to demand that those lands be transferred from the federal government and the people of the United States to the states in which those lands are located. There have been calls for the large-scale transfer of lands in these states, but those efforts have largely been unsuccessful. They have been unsuccessful because the public just doesn't support it. So more recently, we've seen that the more savvy local officials, especially in states like Utah and Nevada, have been pushing for the transfer of management authority rather than the transfer of title to public lands, federal public lands. So the idea there is, while the title to these federal lands would stay with the nation, state and local jurisdictions would have primacy or the primary authority in how those lands are managed. This would give the states and the local jurisdictions the benefits of the title transfer, so they would get to decide on things like how lands are developed for oil and gas or how much logging takes place, but they don't have to pay the costs of ownership, which, in many states, the costs of managing for wildfire are overwhelming. So this would kind of give them the benefits of the deal without the costs of the deal. So we've been seeing a focus on this idea of transferring management authority rather than transferring title to the lands.
Thank you, Chris. And Martin, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think Chris hit it perfectly. It's a great background, very accurate what happened. I would say even more broadly that it is, other than the energy dominance plank of the Trump administration, this selective application of what I call red states' rights is really the defining feature of the Trump administration. And I call it red states' rights because he did everything he could to enable and empower state control of federal public lands, wildlife, and resources, while at the same time putting up all sorts of obstacles to those blue states that were fighting for greater state control and authority.
Thank you. And I was wondering also, is there any real difference between transferring in-fee ownership and transferring management control? Is there like a nuance there, or is it effectively the same thing?
Well, I think Chris hit it perfectly. And, you know, the initial focus when I got involved in 2012 in debating who later became the executive director of the American Lands Council, Jennifer Fielder from Montana, every state outside of California was focused on challenging the constitutionality of federal public lands. And so they were, again, looking for ownership, title. And that blew back pretty significantly in 2017 with Representative Shavitz out of Utah's bill. And from that point on, if you sort of track the strategy of the land seizure movement, they quickly pivoted to looking for control. And as Chris said, they get all of the economic benefits of that control in terms of oil and gas revenue or whatever else without incurring any of the costs associated with title, with federal land ownership.
Yeah, and we saw in the last Congress bills introduced to further this idea. So there was something called the Federal Lands Freedom Act introduced, which would have essentially ceded authority and management of oil and gas development on federal public lands to state agencies. And that would have exempted oil and gas development activities within those states across the West from public participation via NEPA. So, you know, like as Martin said, it gives all the benefits without, you know, burdening the states with the costs of managing the lands.
Thank you, Chris and Martin. I think that was a really succinct way to understand the context of this issue. Also clarify that NEPA is the National Environmental Protection Act. So that would be a way of reducing environmental protection for those preserves.
Thank you, Katie. I need to remember to not use shorthand for a lot of these different statutes.
It's hard when you're an expert, Chris. So I'd actually like to now move to a question for Keala. Can you provide a bit more context about what results the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition is currently advocating for? And I have a follow-up question I'll just say right now in case you want to cover it in the content. Do you think advocates for Bears Ears National Monument have the strongest argument for full protection through the current court case pending in the DC Circuit, or directly through the Biden administration?
Yeah, okay. So, you know, what we are advocating for hasn't really changed since the coalition formed in 2015. At its heart, I think, I like to think of it almost, you know, like what's kind of undergirding everything that I understand the tribes want, which is to reconnect to this landscape and to have a actual seat at the table in deciding its future, how the on-the-ground management takes care of the place. So then how we go about that, you know, whether or not monument status or legislation or some sort of suite of things, I think it almost depends on, well, a few things like what are the risks to it? So I would almost say, Katie, that, you know, the suite of options would be the strongest. If the judge rules in the case and Trump's proclamation is just totally deleted, plus legislation that makes it, you know, unchallengeable in the future. And why not also have an executive action recognizing it? But I would say, you know, kind of when I was prepping for the panel, the tribes don't want to just be acknowledged. I think that they literally want their communities to play an on the ground role in deciding what is right and how to care for this landscape. And the thing that is most recurrent when you talk to them is that they want their youth, they want their elders back out there. You know, some of these tribes were either removed due to settler encroachment or forcibly removed by the government. And overall, they want to be back to some degree and able to have some decision in how that landscape is cared for.
Thank you, Keala. And I think that covers it. And we'll have some more questions that I think this experience will directly speak to. So I'd like to now move to a question for Kristen. And this is a similar question to the one regarding Bears Ears National Monument. And especially in the light of the Trump administration's recent finalization of drilling leases in Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Biden administration's commitment to close the refuge to oil and gas extraction, can you provide more information about what the Alaska Wilderness League is currently advocating for? And do you think advocates for permanent federal protection of ANWR has the strongest argument through the current court cases or directly through the Biden administration?
Thanks. So what we're advocating for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is long-term protections of the coastal plain of the refuge and the protection of the human rights of the Gwich'in people. What we hope to get from the Biden administration is something that I don't have to wait to answer because we have somewhat of breaking news. Basically since noon this afternoon, we're expecting him to sign an executive order sometime today, if not already, that would place a temporary moratorium on all oil and gas leasing activities in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So that's really exciting. We're really happy about that. That's sort of the middle of the story. So I'm going to go backwards to explain where we are with the refuge, and then I'll talk a little bit about what that Biden announcement means. For those that are looking at the chat, you'll see that we tried to link to the list of executive orders that Biden is already rolling out, but they're switching formats, and all of that will soon be on the whitehouse.gov platform. So hopefully somewhere either in this webinar or after the webinar, folks can go ahead and look at some of the stuff that President Biden is already doing. But for the Arctic Refuge, we're really excited that he's already taken actions to protect it. When talking about Alaska, for those of us that do this work, we always end up saying the phrase, everything's different in Alaska, and that's true. The laws that govern federal land management in Alaska are different in many cases than the laws in the lower 48. And so the fight that we have in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, we're fighting basically on two fronts. There's the congressional fight, and then there's the administrative fight. What's really different about the authority for them to drill and those leases that you're talking about in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is that they were put forth in a law in 2017. It was actually the Tax Act, the piece of legislation that gave tax cuts to millions of Americans. But in that same law, they added a provision that would open the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge up for development, and they mandated leasing there. So they mandated that there had to be 2 lease sales in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, one in 2021 and one in 2024. So in many cases, these are administrative processes. For the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the area will be under threat until we can overturn that congressional mandate. Obviously, legislation rules, and then the administration obviously administers the laws. And so for our campaign, what we are going for is overturning that mandate in the Tax Act That's a shorter term goal, and our long-term goal is long-term legislative protections for the coastal plain. So that will be a big focus now that we have a new president, and as everybody knows, we have a different configuration in Congress, and so we're going to be doing a lot of work to try to overturn that law. At the same time, because that mandate happened in 2017, the Trump administration pursued a couple of different really aggressive administrative actions to move forth that development in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And I think anybody that's followed the Trump administration knows that the way that they went about doing business will tend to vary from just bad public policy all the way to like just straight up illegal in the way that they were administrating laws. And so for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, what they tried to do was administer and move a seismic program in parallel to moving a leasing program. Just for oil and gas, it's common sense. What normally happens is they put forth the seismic proposal, they do the seismic activity to figure out where the oil and gas is in a given area, and that informs the lease sale process. When you do the lease sale process, you can lease the least amount of land, and you can kind of direct where you're going to put the lease sale, and that helps with the environmental assessment so that you're not leasing too much land and you know exactly where you need to go. This administration made pretty clear when they came in that they had a political deadline for getting this oil and gas drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge done. They said from the very beginning, they wanted to allow leases in the refuge within 2 years. And if you followed the news, you knew that this was a political deadline, that they had to get this done within the Trump administration if you assume that he only had one term. And so because of that, they did the process for seismic parallel with the process for leasing. That's unusual, but that was really a politically motivated way to do it. So we were fighting both of those processes at the same time. For seismic activity, it's obviously there's a really big burden for them to be able to go someplace like the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. You're talking about, this is in Northeast Alaska. It's completely untouched. It's a wilderness area. Much of it is a wilderness area. It's 19.6 million acres. It's been protected for decades. And it's some of the most sensitive land that you're going to find in the United States. So if you can imagine proposing activity that's going to put 90,000 pound trucks to roll across tundra. And this is permafrost. So this is like frozen soil that the ground is made of that's been melting aggressively because of climate change, and crews of men. And there's just really disruptive activity that they're going to put forth in the coastal plain. It was really difficult for them to adhere to all the environmental laws that they needed to adhere to approve that program. Ultimately, it seemed like they couldn't overcome the burden because on top of how sensitive the land is, it's also critical habitat for polar bears. And so the Endangered Species Act is an act that they're looking at. The refuge is managed under the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. It's managed under the Wilderness Act. They have to put all of these processes through the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, which we talked about earlier. So there's a series of laws that they had to adhere to in order to be able to safely put this program forward. They weren't able to do it for a couple winters, and they had tried again recently. And we were literally checking our email up until noon today to see if those seismic permits had been approved because they were trying to get a seismic program over the finish line so that was done coming into the Biden administration. And it's much harder for a new administration to remove a finalized decision than it is to stop a decision that is in process. And so for that seismic proposal, and now it's 3:25, so I think I can safely say they did not finalize seismic for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge before Biden got into office today. And that's great news because this executive order that I'm talking about today says that they now have to pause all of those activities. And so it's going to be in the Biden administration's hands to go backwards and look at all of the work that was done around the legal assessment for that seismic program and determine what they're going to do with that going forward. We've asked for a full legal review. Over here is the other part of the administrative process, which is holding a lease sale. Unfortunately, they were able to get that one done a little bit faster. They started the process literally right after Trump, right after the law passed. A year after Trump took office. And so they did a very aggressive NEPA process, which they finalized in 2019. They weren't able to get the record of decision finalized for another year. And in the meantime, we had a pandemic, the oil markets crashed. And so there are all kinds of questions about whether that oil and gas lease sale could go forward. Obviously questions about whether it should go forward. And we obviously litigated as soon as the environmental part of the process started. And so as of August, when they signed the record of decision, which is the final part of the process for environmental review for the lease sale, we went to court. The Gwich'in Steering Committee, which is the Gwich'in Nation, which lives on the migratory route of the porcupine caribou herd that lives in the Arctic Refuge. They were the lead plaintiffs in our lawsuit. There was another group of environmental organizations that sued. There were a group of tribes that sued and a group of state attorney generals that sued. So there are 4 lawsuits now pending on those lease sales in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This came down literally yesterday to go through the lease sale process. They held the lease sale. They just held it on January 6th. And by all accounts, it was a complete failure. What the tax act had required them to do, what the tax act had said that the motivation or the reasoning for this lease sale was that it was going to raise $1.8 billion for the American public. That was the justification for them adding it to the bill that they did. Ultimately, the lease sale provided $14 million in revenues. That's less than 1% of the whole entire basis for putting this lease sale in law. And beyond that, only 2 small companies bid, and the third company that took the majority of the leases was really a corporation owned by the state of Alaska. So there's all kinds of complicated questions around what it means for a state-owned corporation to bid on leases. And there's questions around the way that they did the process for the lease sale. And so this is obviously still in court, but unfortunately, because they jammed this lease sale through in the last minute, and literally we found out yesterday that they had gotten the bids signed by the companies and they had gotten all the paperwork finalized. As of yesterday, there are companies that hold leases on the coastal plain. So that's a little bit of bad news, but we are now at 3:25 on January 20th. So there's a lot of good news. And so that takes us back to the executive order. Right now, this means that we can at least rest assured that no activity is going to take place. They're not going to start moving forward on these leases. They are not going to do activity towards seismic. And now we need to turn to the Biden administration and work with them on taking a step back and looking at the entirety of the process that was put forward that we would say was incredibly illegal, had all kinds of legal deficiencies. And we'll hope that they will be able to change the entire legal basis for the program. In the meantime, we really have to look to Congress to overturn that legislative mandate.
Thank you, Kristen. That was a really great introduction to that concept, and to both you and Keala for giving us some insight into how local communities are advocating and how this work cycles back onto federal policy making. So now I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Maddie. She's got some deeper dive questions now that we've gotten some of these background ideas into the mindset of the group here. So Maddie can take it away.
Great, thank you. So Keala and Kristen already touched on this a little bit, but we wanted to broaden out more. And this question is for any of the panelists who'd like to answer. I think we'd like to start with Chris, if that works for you. So the question is, do existing laws and legislation support public land conservation? How do you anticipate trends and policies may change with the new administration?
Well, you know, the bedrock environmental laws, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act, and then the National Forest Management Act for the Forest Service, and for BLM managed public lands, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. All those statutes are more than 40 years old. Some of them are 50 years old. And they haven't really changed in that time. The regulations that implement those laws have changed over time with successive administrations, with the Republican presidents looking to roll back the impact of those statutes, and then the Democratic presidents looking to maybe give those statutes more teeth. But the goals of almost all those acts were really grand. For example, the Clean Water Act called for eliminating the discharge of pollutants into the nation's waters. That was in 1972, and 49 years later, we can see that we're nowhere near close to reaching those goals. So given what we know now compared to what we knew then, for example, the effects of climate change, the impact of population growth, our understanding of the interrelationships of species, impacts of wildfire, and even how the courts would interpret those laws after they were enacted. While we've made considerable progress, it's clear now that those laws aren't going to achieve their goals. So I would say it's certainly a big ask with a Congress this closely divided and a public this polarized. But I would say the statutes, our bedrock environmental laws, are overdue for updates.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that. Does anyone else have any thoughts about this question? Okay, we'll move on to the next one. This is a question from the audience, from Susan, and it's directed to Martin, but if anyone else has thoughts, we'd love to hear them. So the question is, in the Trump administration, shared stewardship was seen as a bilateral relationship between the states and the federal government, with the states taking the lead on federal land management. In the Biden administration, how do you see shared stewardship changing, particularly with respect to tribal co-management?
Who asked that question? Jeez. I'm no expert on, I'm not sure where that, I'm trying to figure out where that source of that question comes from so I can give a good response. In this recent report of ours by Professor Monty Mills and I focused on tribal co-management. I think one of the things that we do that got some interest is try to place tribal co-management in the context of federalism. And we sort of systematically go through most of our federal public land statutes to demonstrate the very privileged position that states are in when it comes to federal lands management. They're given a prioritized position in most cases, especially when it comes to federal public lands planning. And so we dissect those statutes and show that in almost every single case, how the tribes are treated so much differently and are not provided the same degree of status and opportunities as provided to the states. And we can look at this in terms of shared stewardship, which is one of these more recent. It has some balance. It's not as egregious as some of the examples that Chris referenced earlier in terms of states' rights, but it nevertheless gives states a significant amount of authority. And so we talk about shared stewardship in that context, but I think the most important point is just to, again, look, and this follows Chris's earlier comment, it's an opportunity to do something different when it comes to public lands and Native nations. And I think tribal co-management provides one opportunity to sort of build that bridge.
Perfect. Thank you so much for answering that. And for the next question, again, this is for any of the panelists who'd like to answer, maybe starting with Kristen or Keala this time. And the question is, we would like to talk a little bit more about the motivations for public land transfer and leasing. And so proponents often argue that land is more economically beneficial when it is in private hands. So how would you respond to this argument? And is there a way to balance all types of land uses, or is this a winner takes all dynamic?
Well, everything's a little bit different in Alaska, but for Alaska, much of the federal land debate tends to be around massive extractive industries. And it's really a matter of the way that the world is changing. For Alaska, I mean, I already talked a little bit about the Arctic Refuge lease sale. The failure of that lease sale obviously had to do with the controversy around drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but it also had to do with the global oil market and the fact that the world is starting to see this need to transition to more sustainable economies and away from oil. What led up to this lease sale was obviously the oil industry changing in Alaska, and companies are leaving, companies that have been there for decades, but also major banks not wanting to invest in some of these most dangerous oil and gas massive projects. And so the transfer to the state, I mean, to the extent that you're going to use it for oil and gas development or transfer to private interests, it's just not going to be as profitable if we going forward using it for oil and gas. There's other areas of the state in which you can see that you can profit even off of federal lands, and there's smaller sustainable industries, there's tourism, there's fishing, and there's ways that these federal lands can be profitable in a sustainable way. And that's not necessarily going to change by transferring to private hands. And so there are many uses that we can use our federal lands for, especially in the last 4 years, but often the predominant use has been overly emphasized on extractive industries, but there's so much economic benefit that we can get from sustainable industries and industries that really support the people that are living in those communities. And that's the kind of transfer, and that's the kind of like thinking that we need to be doing about federal lands into the future.
Great. Did anyone else have any thoughts they wanted to add to that?
I would just add that this idea that public land is more economically beneficial when it's privatized is an idea that goes back to the founding of our country. One of the the leading justifications, or one of the primary justifications for stealing land from the native inhabitants, was that those people were not putting the land they had to productive use, so that it was the white person's responsibility to take those lands. So this idea that we need to privatize to make something offer larger economic benefits is it's old, and it's just wrong. It's misplaced. It's not the duty of the federal government to maximize economic benefits.
Yeah, Chris, that's such a great comment. And it's such an important question, though, too, because it is such a part of the narrative that we've seen since 2012. And it's so bogus on so many levels that, I've had this debate with Senator Fielder multiple times in the American Lands Council, and they try to always contrast the purported inefficiency of federal public lands with all of the revenue generating possibilities of state trust lands, and say, look at what the states are doing in comparison to the federal government. And it's so bogus because those state trust lands are not public lands, right? And I think there's so much misunderstanding about state lands, and the media hasn't caught on to that. And so it's just an argument that has somehow found traction that doesn't make any sense, because in fact, our federal public lands, buried in some of these multiple use statutes, is a provision that explicitly tells agencies like the BLM and the Forest Service not to manage for the greatest dollar return or something unit. I forget the exact sentence now, but it's essentially Congress in 1960 and again in 1976 telling the Forest Service and BLM, we don't want you to manage your lands like Weyerhaeuser manages its corporate timberlands. And it's not going to be on a time horizon that's every quarter. It's going to be for present and future generations, for posterity. And so I'll stop. That question riles me up, obviously. So.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for your answers. So this next question is from the audience for Keala. And the question has a few different parts, so let me know if you want me to repeat anything. But So Wade and Alexandra both asked a similar question, which is, what are successful processes or policies to use in order to give or honor decision-making abilities of our Indigenous communities? For example, Deb Haaland, Biden's nominee for Secretary of the Interior, will most likely be the next Interior Secretary. She will be the first Native American cabinet member of any administration. How do you view this historic nomination, and how do you think Ms. Haaland will lead such an important federal agency?
Yeah, well, it's super exciting that she will likely be confirmed. And, you know, this is kind of riffing off of one of the questions, I don't know if that we're still going to get to, but some of the ways that I think public lands can shift for the betterment of all of us is very obviously happening with the selection of Deb Haaland. You know, conservation for a long time was this kind of sleepy, older white guy scene, and it's changing. You know, I mean, I'm in maybe because of the, you know, it being targeted by people like the Bundys, the last president, that people are now attending to it, and it's in the news. It's becoming more diverse, and the extent to which, and I'd love to throw it to Martin here, the extent to which there can be government-wide policies that make the land management agencies look more like America. I think it will embed some of the different perspectives, some of the different values, so that the management of public lands really starts to represent values as diverse as our populace. Did I miss any of the questions?
No, I think that was great. Martin, do you want to say anything to that?
Oh, well, I mean, Keala and Bears Ears, I think, just needs to be highlighted in this discussion, because it's just one of these most groundbreaking moments where you see a real concrete proposal on federal public lands, this effort to sort of harmonize the first principles of federal Indian law with federal public lands law, and do it on a sort of day-to-day management basis. So I just think it is so groundbreaking, just like the nomination of Deb Haaland, that I think will just be such a transformational character in so many ways. And so we need more example like Bears Ears, and the Badger 2 medicine that I've been involved with provides another example, just a rethinking. And that's kind of the basis of our tribal co-management report, is that for too long, our federal public land agencies have sort of treated their trust obligation to tribes and these treaty rights as ancillary to their core mission. It's always an afterthought, right? It's making the substantive decisions and then doing consultation. And that has to be reversed. And there's lots of very practical, feasible steps that can be taken by the Biden administration to correct that past and to start a more exciting era.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. So the next question again is for all of the panelists and whoever would like to answer, which is, what do you see as the most significant current threat to our public lands? In addition to that, what do you think is the most effective way to protect our public lands? For example, through legal challenges, legislation, executive orders, or grassroots advocacy? And Kristen, maybe if you want to start that off, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, the answer to the second part, I think, changed at noon, but honestly, the climate and biodiversity crisis is the affecting every single public land drastically. And I think every decision that we make around public lands has to be made under that umbrella. And I think that we've seen that the Biden administration definitely sees it that way. It's addressing the climate and biodiversity crisis in a way that honors frontline communities and does things with justice and equity. You know, I mean, I can talk specifically about Alaska. It's no secret that Alaska is being affected by climate change more drastically than anywhere else in the country. The Arctic is warming at 3 times the rate the rest of the world. And the really good news is it seems like the American public is waking up to this and it's starting to be more in the lexicon, and you're starting to see it in the polling, and people are accepting it, and it's part of conversation. You know, we've been working with tribes that live in rural Alaska for decades, and we've been hearing these stories. You can't talk to a tribal member from Alaska about anything in which they won't share traditional knowledge about the drastic changes that they've seen on the ground. And that's front of mind for all of them. And so that is, I think, definitely the biggest challenge we face for a group like mine, and probably many of the people on the call. We deal with public lands, and public lands is a piece of the equation for solving the climate crisis. For us, it's about ending the oil and gas, because that's part of the future emissions. I think it's something like 20 to 25% of the emissions that the United States has is from our federal public lands. We can drastically reduce that if we change the dominant use, which has been oil and gas for many of these lands. And that in turn, you know, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis go hand in hand. And then we also have to honor those frontline communities, because many of them are frontline communities by force, as we've talked about. They didn't choose to be frontline oil and gas communities. That was thrust upon them, and we need to give them the resources to be able to continue their subsistence lifestyle and be able to live as we end those activities.
Great. Does anyone else have any thoughts about that one? Chris, maybe? Martin? Whoever would like to go.
Well, I'll just say, I'll give an unusual answer. I think the sort of darkness, well, up until noon today, I suppose, but the dysfunction that is currently American politics, I think, is the biggest threat to our public lands. And I'll just remind participants that, you know, what preceded the seditious insurrection at the Capitol was the armed occupation of Keala National Wildlife Refuge. And it was the same sort of poison and violent tactics that we saw at Bunkerville. And so I think public lands are part of this larger broken system. And yeah, I'm most worried about that, I suppose.
Yeah, I think I would
largely down our statement to make.
I would support Kristen's statement. The continued use of public lands in 2021 for oil and gas development, you know, when we're staring down the barrel of a climate crisis, it's really unconscionable that we're, you know, that the dominant use, as Kristen said, of so much of our public land is for oil and gas development. It just simply doesn't make any sense. And hopefully will stop very soon with the new administration.
Yeah, definitely. So we have time for just one more question, and we'd love to hear from all of the panelists on this one, which is, what makes you most hopeful for the future of land conservation? And Keala, maybe if you want to get us started.
Sure. Yeah, so a little bit of what I touched on before is conservation is kind of having a moment. And probably like a lot of people that are watching the panel, I didn't imagine wanting to do anything else for my career. So I didn't sort of have to kind of come around. But the fact that, you know, so much is being covered in the news, that so many people are voting people out, voting people in based on where they fall on the conservation spectrum, that's huge. And, you know, a little bit in terms of the threat, it's two sides of the same coin. is, time and apathy. So the fact that there is a greater sense of urgency and attention going on to what we do with our public lands is the most exciting thing, I'd say, that I've seen shift in definitely the last 4 years, but maybe more like 10.
Kristen, would you like to go next?
Sure. Well, I would agree with Keala. I mean, sort of what I talked about before. I mean, like Keala said, the increased awareness of conservation and what we're doing on our federal public lands. And I mean, there's a reason why the Biden administration has come in with an aggressive stance towards climate, biodiversity, and Indigenous peoples and frontline communities. It's because it's what our nation is waking up to. What my kids are exposed to is so different than what I grew up with, and what they care about and what the younger generation cares about. You can see it. It's going to be a new world. And so not only addressing these crises, but melding the idea of conservation with addressing wrongs, historical wrongs with the Indigenous communities, and addressing historical wrongs with frontline communities. The fact that that is so embraced, and so much so that a new administration came in writing its policies around that, just makes me so hopeful. And I mean, I got to announce an executive order 3 hours into a new administration. That's only just the beginning of what is possible. So I feel pretty good today on January 20th.
Martin, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I am uncharacteristically optimistic. Yes, this question, really gets you thinking about the last 4 years. And I'll just say, maybe, I'm usually so cynical. Build back better. What does that mean? It's such a cliche, but in this case, I think it really means something. I think things are so fundamentally broken over the last, so many different parts have been attacked and broken, that there's an opportunity to completely do things differently to build back better. And I think about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, this unprecedented assault on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And here we are facing a crisis, this avian crisis, 1 in 4 birds gone since 1970. Here we have an opportunity to go back and revisit the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and perhaps institute a new sort of permitting scheme that takes that crisis seriously. Or I think a lot about Southeast Alaska and the Tongass, and it's yet another example where the Trump administration gave the keys to the car to the state of Alaska that gave itself an opt-out of the national roadless rule. And so the most obvious pathway is just to reinstate roadless protection. But hopefully the Biden administration will say, this is an opportunity to do something fundamentally different, like not only protect roadless, but also honor Alaska Native tribes who have requested their own, petitioned the USDA for a traditional homelands rule. And so maybe we can get roadless area protection, sovereignty, tribal self-determination, the whole thing. I mean, to me, that's building back better, like using this as an opportunity to do something big.
I'll agree with that.
Yeah, I'll agree with that too. I think what makes me hopeful is the fact that the people in this country so firmly support public lands and love public lands. In poll after poll, we see that significant majorities of people, even in states that we consider to be really conservative, like Utah or Wyoming or Nevada, citizens or residents of those states value public lands and want to see them protected and want to see less extraction. So it's really just a matter of harnessing that public support through better advocacy and better organizing. And you know, the Trump administration is in the rearview mirror, so it seems like now is the time.
Thanks, Chris. And I think as we wrap it up here, we've only got a couple more minutes, but I'm wondering, as a follow-up to that question, is there a specific recommendation or policy that you would really like to see enacted in the next 4 years? And if you know, each one of you could have a chance at that. But you know, if you had 30 seconds in an elevator with Joe Biden, what would you say? Martin, you're laughing, so I'm going to pick on you.
That's a pressure-filled question. 30 seconds in an elevator. I want a new jointly issued secretarial memo by Interior and Agriculture on tribal co-management on federal public lands.
Thank you. Who else is ready?
Well, since Martin already did that one, I will ask him. I mean, we're so issue specific. So since I started with the Arctic Refuge, I would like to see legislative protections restored for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
Thanks, Kristen.
I can't stay specific to Bears Ears because I know the tribes themselves only want Bears Ears to be something, you know, as used as a positive example to recreate. So it really would be in line with Martin's point, which is, you know, every agency should have a shall, not a may consultation when there's a federal undertaking. This like kind of like if you have time and you can send them a quick, you know, little letter that frontline communities, the tribes that were removed are no longer frontline because they were removed from their ancestral homelands, having them be part of the decisions going forward for public lands somehow made as a shall instead of some sort of, you know, if you have time.
That's a great distinction. Thank you. And Chris?
I would ask President Biden to follow through on his pledge to suspend all fossil fuels leasing on public lands across the United States.
Those are some really powerful statements to close on. And I really want to thank each one of you, our panelists, all of the folks who tuned in today. I think I saw we got up to 85 participants today and some really excellent questions. So thank you to everybody for engaging in these topics. And I certainly feel you know, really hopeful. You've left me with some great ideas. And I know our audience feels that way as well. And unfortunately, that's all the time we've got for our discussion today on public lands. So we'd like to thank you all again and remind you that our next seminar is discussing the 30 by 30 campaign for conservation on January 27th, next Wednesday at noon. That's the final in our series of panels. Our previous ones were about water and fire management, in addition to this one on federal land. So you can see those recordings on our website at conservationpolicydiscussions.org, and also learn more and register for the upcoming event. And we encourage you to share this series with your friends, colleagues, and elected officials. And I've certainly been taking notes on what our panelists have shared today. And when I get a chance to speak with Biden in the elevator, I know what to say. So thank you all so much for joining us today and for this really wonderful conversation on a very important day in American history. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.